Across continents, from Paris, London, to New York, traces of Ottoman influence quietly shaped the modern world.
The fall of Vienna wasn't just a local defeat, it was a signal. Across Central Europe, rulers held their breath. But some would have no time to react. Bavaria, exposed and leaderless, would crumble within days. Its fragmented cities, Augsburg, Regensburg, and Passau, too divided to resist. Austria itself, with its capital lost, would see nobles flee westward or swear loyalty to the Sultan in desperation. The Bohemian crown, once proud, would find Prague opening its gates not with gunfire, but with white flags. Hungary, still divided between Habsburg and Ottoman spheres, would quickly unify under the Crescent. The people there remembered the Ottomans, not just as conquerors, but as governors. Further north, Saxony and the fragmented Protestant states would hesitate, but with no coordinated defense, they too would fall, one by one. In the south, Venice might hold for a while, but without Austria as a buffer, its trade routes would collapse. Only France and England would have time to prepare, and even they would watch nervously as the tide rolled westward. The first to fall would not be those who resisted, but those who waited. The Ottomans didn't conquer to destroy, they conquered to govern. And when new territories in Central Europe fell under their control, they didn't impose chaos, they imposed order. Each newly acquired region was placed under the authority of a Beylerbey, a provincial governor answerable to Istanbul. Local administrators were retained when useful, but ultimate authority rested with the Porte. Tax systems were restructured. Land was measured, registered, and redistributed under the Timar system, rewarding loyalty with responsibility. Justice was handed down by Candace, trained in Islamic law, but instructed to respect local customs and community leaders. Sharia existed, but not in isolation. Christian and Jewish communities governed their own civil affairs under the millet system. Churches remained open, monasteries were taxed but protected, clergy were watched, not banished, markets operated under vakif law, blending faith with function, and trade was revitalized. Vienna's old Christian guilds now worked alongside Muslim artisans. Ottoman architects rebuilt damaged fortresses, restored roads, and added fountains and caravanserais. Language remained local, but Turkish terms entered law, finance, and diplomacy. There was no single mold. Each region was adapted to, not flattened by, the empire's model. And in that adaptation, the empire thrived. Not through force alone, but through a system designed not just to expand, but to last. The Ottomans didn't conquer to destroy, they conquered to govern. And when new territories in Central Europe fell under their control, they didn't impose chaos, they imposed order. Each newly acquired region was placed under the authority of a Beylerbey, a provincial governor answerable to Istanbul. Local administrators were retained when useful, but ultimate authority rested with the Porte. Tax systems were restructured. Land was measured, registered, and redistributed under the Timar system, rewarding loyalty with responsibility. Justice was handed down by Candace, trained in Islamic law, but instructed to respect local customs and community leaders. Sharia existed, but not in isolation. Christian and Jewish communities governed their own civil affairs under the millet system. Churches remained open, monasteries were taxed but protected, clergy were watched, not banished, markets operated under vakif law, blending faith with function. Trade was revitalized. Vienna's old Christian guilds now worked alongside Muslim artisans, and Ottoman architects rebuilt damaged fortresses, restored roads, and added fountains and caravanserais. Language remained local, but Turkish terms entered law, finance, and diplomacy. There was no single mold. Each region was adapted to, not flattened by, in the empire's model, and in that adaptation, the empire thrived, not through force alone, but through a system designed not just to expand, but to last. After Vienna fell, cartographers faced a new reality. The maps that once proudly marked the borders of Catholic monarchies had to be redrawn, this time with crescent symbols where crosses once stood. The Holy Roman Empire, once a tangle of duchies and principalities, ceased to exist. Its lands were divided into Ottoman administrative provinces, sanjaks and eyalets replacing kingdoms and electorates. The Habsburg dominions were erased from the center of the continent. Instead, a vast belt of Ottoman influence stretched from Hungary to Bavaria, from Prague to the Adriatic Sea. The Balkans, now fully absorbed, became a bridge between Istanbul and the heart of Europe. Vienna became not a front line, but a capital, a gateway city linking east and west under one empire. Poland, pressed between empires, was forced into neutrality or submission. Italy splintered, the north leaning toward France, the south influenced by Ottoman trade and fleets. Borders faded as road systems unified, currency stabilized, and trade moved under a central authority. City-states like Venice and Genoa lost dominance, they adapted or disappeared. And new capitals emerged. Budapest, Sarajevo, and Krakow rose in prominence, no longer regional but imperial cities. The idea of a Europe of nations dissolved. In its place, an empire without Latin as its language and without Rome at its center. Empires do not only redraw maps, they reshape the soul of a continent. When the Ottomans expanded into Central Europe, they didn't aim to erase Christianity or European culture, they layered over them. Catholicism didn't vanish, but it lost its monopoly. Protestant reformers found unexpected breathing room under Ottoman tolerance. Lutheran communities, no longer persecuted by Catholic powers, could worship freely as long as taxes were paid. Orthodox Christians in the Balkans saw little change, and they had lived under the millet system for centuries and continued to do so. But something deeper shifted. Power no longer flowed from Rome or Wittenberg. It radiated from Istanbul. Cultural fusion became inevitable. Mosques and cathedrals stood side by side. Markets sold both German rye bread and Turkish lokum. Philosophers debated Ibn Sina and Descartes in the same university courtyard. Resistance didn't disappear. It transformed. Underground writers questioned Ottoman rule through allegory and satire. Secret societies met in candlelit basements not to restore borders, but to redefine identity. In music, old hymns gained Eastern melodies. In art, halos blended with arabesques. In architecture, flying buttresses curved into domes. This wasn't conquest alone. It was cultural negotiation, messy, beautiful, and irreversible. With every new conquest, the Ottoman Empire inherited not just cities and trade routes, but identities. Germans, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Hungarians, each came with languages, customs, and loyalties. The millet system had worked well in the East, but Central Europe posed new challenges. Communities were more politically aware, more tied to national identity. How do you govern Vienna and Sarajevo under the same law? How do you balance loyalty between Mecca, Istanbul, and Prague? Ottoman administrators struggled to maintain unity without silencing culture. Too much tolerance risked fragmentation, too much control sparked resistance. The empire, once a mosaic, now felt like a pressure cooker. Beautiful, but volatile. Victory brings territory, but it also brings distance, and the further the empire stretched into Europe, the heavier the burden became. Supplying armies across the Alps meant months of coordination. Food spoiled, wagons broke, and winter cut off entire regions. Administrators in Istanbul wrote decrees that took weeks to arrive, and longer to understand. Local officials struggled to interpret orders in languages they barely spoke, for people they barely knew. Corruption spread where oversight thinned. Bribes replaced orders, records vanished. An empire designed for the Mediterranean was now gasping for breath in the heart of Europe, and no system, not even the Ottoman one, was built to stretch forever. Empires rely on trust or fear, but both have limits. In cities like Krakow, Milan, and Graz, Ottoman rule was accepted but ever embraced. Local nobles signed treaties and whispered rebellion. Religious leaders gave sermons in public and plotted in private. As Ottoman officials arrived, so did new taxes, new languages, and new expectations. But identity doesn't shift overnight, and loyalty cannot be ordered. Some towns grew quiet, others hostile. Protests turned into riots. Former allies vanished, replaced by rumor and silence. The empire, once expanding through strategy and awe, now faced the slow poison of mistrust. It wasn't swords that threatened the Ottomans, it was doubt. The empire was growing westward, but its systems were still rooted in the east. Decisions came from Istanbul, shaped for cities like Aleppo or Cairo, not Vienna or Warsaw. European cities demanded faster courts, local representation, and economic freedoms. But the old Ottoman machinery moved slow, and in only one direction. The scholars in Edirne warned of strain. Governors begged for modern tools, yet the palace feared change more than chaos. Without reform, the empire risked suffocating under its own size, and reform meant more than laws. It meant letting go of control. The question was no longer whether change was needed, but whether the East could adapt in time to save the West. The Renaissance was Europe's great awakening, but what if its heartbeat changed? If Vienna had fallen, the Ottoman presence in Europe might not have halted the Renaissance, but erected it. Artistic patronage may have shifted from popes to pashas. Humanist ideas might have blended with Sufi mysticism. Galileo's telescope could have shared shelf space with Ibn al-Haytham's manuscripts. Florence and Rome would lose their monopoly on genius. Cities like Budapest, Sarajevo, and even Istanbul might have become the new capitals of creativity. The Renaissance would not have ended. It would have worn different robes and spoken more than one language. Europe rediscovered Aristotle through the works of Muslim philosophers. But what if those ideas hadn't just crossed borders, but ruled from them? Had Vienna fallen, thinkers like Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd might have entered university halls centuries earlier. Logic, metaphysics, and theology could have followed different paths. Aquinas may have debated not only Augustine, but also Averroes, in Latin and Arabic alike. Madrasa and monastery might have stood side by side. The Enlightenment may not have replaced religion, but refined it through fusion. And the West's mind might have expanded not in isolation, but in dialogue. Before the Ottomans, Europe was already divided, not by borders, but by faith. Catholics in Rome, Protestants in Wittenberg, Orthodox Christians in the East. Had Vienna fallen, the balance would have shifted drastically. The Catholic Church would have lost political protection. The Protestant movement, still young, might have sought Ottoman tolerance to survive. The Pope may have fled south. Lutheran leaders may have accepted Ottoman sovereignty in exchange for autonomy. Islam wouldn't replace Christianity, but might have become its unexpected guardian. Faith lines would remain, but under a new ceiling. And Europe's religious identity, once rigid and divided, may have become layered and complex. East and West were never short of genius, only bridges. Had the Ottomans stayed in Europe, those bridges might have been built with stone, paper, and ink. Imagine a tradition where Al-Farabi's political thought meets Montesquieu's law, where Rumi's mysticism tempers Enlightenment reason. Universities might have taught logic with Persian poetry. Students may have quoted both Plato and Al-Ghazali. In the same debate, the divide between sacred and secular, so sharp in European thought, could have softened, not by rejection, but by integration. A new intellectual tradition wouldn't erase the old, it would layer over it. A palimpsest of East and West illuminated by shared curiosity. Imagine Paris with domed skylines, Berlin with shaded courtyards, Madrid with fountains whispering Persian poetry. If the Ottomans had remained in power, today's cities might not look taller but deeper. Public spaces would blend Ottoman gardens with Gothic plazas. Streets would curve around courtyards, not just concrete. Train stations shaped like caravanserais. Cafes under arches instead of awnings. Mosques and cathedrals sharing city blocks, not in tension but in dialogue. From Budapest to Brussels, cities would hum with a blended aesthetic, tilework, domes, and light filtering through lattice. Modernity wouldn't mean removing the past, but living inside a more layered one. Imagine Baroque paintings framed in arabesque patterns, and European catwalks echoing with flowing caftans and embroidered jackets. If Ottoman influence had taken root, fashion would value modest elegance, gold thread, geometric motifs, and layers of silk, not just to impress, but to express tradition. Art wouldn't be erased, but woven into new forms, a continent clothed in continuity, not conflict. What if European law evolved under Ottoman administration? Parliaments still existed, but with council halls echoing with Persian, Arabic, and Turkish debates. Constitutional law would merge with Sharia-based frameworks. Civil codes shaped by both Roman precedent and Islamic jurisprudence. Elections may still happen, but candidates wear turbans over suits. Justice would blend logic with morality, courts balancing divine law and civic duty, and international diplomacy might be conducted not over champagne, but over sherbet with calligraphy-filled treaties, not east or west, but a legal tradition born in the middle. History is made not just by power, but by memory. If the Ottomans had remained, a shared identity may have taken root. Children in Paris might learn both Molière and Mevlana. Ramadan and Easter celebrated on the same calendar. Names like Ahmed Rousseau or Fatima Voltaire might not be strange, but common. The crescent and the cross engraved together on coins. Songs blending oud with violin echoing in Vienna cafes. Not a clash of civilizations, but a blended one. A Europe not conquered, but composed. What if the Siege of Vienna had ended differently? History didn't go that way, but it could have. And somewhere in another timeline, maybe it did. If you want to explore how one event could reshape continents, subscribe now, and don't miss our next episode of What If History.